I'm actually a bit of an interloper here because I'm not an academic, I'm a politician. But it's been really interesting to hear so many intelligent people talk about statecraft and leadership, and it does make me reflect, actually, maybe we should be mixing more than we are at the moment. So I'm very glad to be here, and thank you very much to the Foundation for having me. You might be wondering why I'm going to talk to you about free speech in a session on tech. But the quest for truth provides us with the moral coordinates for technological and scientific progress. And where debate has been suppressed in the past, it's only held us back. And now we're very grateful for the Galileos, the Darwins, the Newtons, for pushing forward our frontiers of understanding, particularly in the face of great opposition. And it's helped us shape our understanding of astronomy, mathematics, natural science, biology, and we wouldn't be where we are today if those visionaries hadn't believed in freedom of speech and the pursuit of truth. And yet one of the things that we see today is that free speech is under threat in the very places where the most controversial debates should be taking place, on university campuses. Now, I think most people here would agree, and it's been a huge pleasure to talk to so many people over the last day about some of these issues, is that the telos of a university is to create independent thinkers who are equipped with the tools to think about the world critically. I mean, they are the training ground of the next business leaders, the political leaders, the moral leaders of tomorrow. And this generation will need these skills of critical thought more than ever before. We've seen that on great display, I think, in terms of some of the analysis that people have been talking about over the last 24 hours. Because the pace of technological change is more than any of us are ever going to be prepared for. We're going to have to govern and regulate new powers. We're going to have to develop ethical guardrails. We're going to have resilience in our political leadership, which is something that I feel quite keenly coming from Britain, where we've had 3 prime ministers in the past year. And we are going to have to make sure that we can meet that pace of change with everything that happens in government. And take the onset of AI, which we've heard people speak about quite eloquently so far. The next generation of leaders will face even thornier questions than we are facing in government at the moment, in terms of the role that large language models might play in war strategy, in navigating sort of copyright disputes between human artists and AI, in thinking about deepfake pornography and how that might be regulated. Some of these things are really challenging ethical dilemmas, and we've got no immediate answer. And we're going to do the leaders of tomorrow a disservice if we shelter them from other points of view and we withhold from them the opportunity to develop their critical thinking. As Mill famously said, we deprive ourselves of the chance of debate, and it also denies us the clearer perception of truth produced by its collision with error. And I think that's the point about freedom of speech. It's our best error defense mechanism. And yet that is what we have been seeing in our universities. And that's why part of my work as Education Minister in the UK has been taking in a new Freedom of Speech Act through the British Parliament. I've talked to quite a few of you over the last 24 hours. It's been interesting to hear everyone's experiences, because some people have said, you know what, I haven't seen so much of that. And then some people have had some quite troubling stories to share. And I think what we've seen in the UK is students who are being deprived of attending events, visiting speakers, being intimidated by aggressive protests, and in the worst cases, academics losing their livelihoods, their reputations for the crime of expressing opinions. And all of this is being driven by a very small group of activists who are shouting the loudest, who are firing off lots of tweets, drafting open letters, creating an impression that their view is shared by the majority. And we've seen in certain cases how dangerous this is when it manifests itself on campus. So many of you will be familiar with Kathleen, who's a university professor who was hounded out of her university in the UK by a toxic, organised campaign to get her fired for expressing what was actually quite a mainstream view about the status of biological sex. And you may have heard, potentially, about Laura Favaro, who had an evidence-based research project on the suppression of women's voices in academia. Her research was deemed too dangerous to publish by her university. So in other words, her research into censorship was censored, which is sort of beyond parody. But it's even spread to disciplines as far from politics as you can imagine, such as maths. In the course of my work, I spoke to lots of different academics to understand the picture of what was happening in our universities. And I think one of my most astonishing conversations I had was with untenured mathematicians who were being pressured into decolonising their maths curriculum, which meant that they had to suppress the work of white mathematicians and elevate the work of non-white mathematicians. And they found this, obviously understandably, really concerning. But they were also very fearful of speaking out because the backlash would have put their jobs at risk. And now, I was a mathematician and philosopher by discipline. I used an Indian decimal system. We worked with Arabian-born algebra and complex analysis, which was based on imaginary numbers forged in Europe. And it made me think of the words of David Hilbert, who was a mathematician, who said, "Mathematics knows no race, geographic boundaries, for mathematics is the cultural world of one country." And you think if this science, the purest of all sciences, can be infiltrated by some of these thinkings, there really is no limits in how far people will reach in pursuing some of these views. And the insidiously enforced censorship which was bubbling away under the surface, where students and academics with very mainstream views were too afraid to talk about those things, it shocked us in the UK, and we were looking at the overall research in terms of self-censorship, and 1/3 of academics in the UK were reporting self-censoring. The data in Europe is a bit more spotty, but it's a similar level. In the US, it was about half of academics. And as something you'll all be familiar with, often it was the tenured academics who felt more able to speak out, to have more controversial views, and it was their more junior colleagues who felt very much like they had to stay in the narrow box that they'd been put in. And I think there's twofold things there. One, that's not what we want for academics. We want people to be able to speak about anything that they want, whether it's controversial or not, in those settings. But also I think it was making the job very unrewarding. It was making people feel that they didn't have the space to explore the ideas that they wanted to. And we knew it wasn't just an issue for those on the right. While the people on the right were more likely to self-censor, we found in the UK, 38% of left-leaning academics in social sciences also reported that they felt that due to the social pressure that they were facing, they couldn't really express their views. And also, it directly affects tech and innovation, because we know that academic freedom boosts innovation. We've got studies which show that when academic freedom rises by one standard deviation, the number of patents 2 years later jumps by about 40%. So it affects us in all of these ways, and this creep of self-censorship definitely matters. I mean, one of the big arguments that we've seen happen in the UK is about women's rights, which obviously has a huge impact. But there was another one which I think we really saw this conformity and consensus inhibit the debate, which was ending COVID lockdowns. And that was something I personally felt as a junior politician at the time, who was very sceptical and was speaking against further lockdowns in the UK against government. But the social media-led culture of conformity that had been created made it much harder for people to voice these genuine concerns about major issues that were affecting the country. So we chose to take action because we wanted to end, or at least try and put a marker in the sand to this culture of intimidation, which was like an intellectual sedative that's being injected into the university experience. But first, I want to sort of talk a bit about why that culture has developed. Because as technology has grown more powerful, it's grown the need for free speech, and we're going to be able to need these skills more than ever. But also, it's caused part of the problem. And I think, as I was discussing with people yesterday, a big part of what's happened is the rise of social media and the pressure that it's put on people, because social media has opened up connections between individuals on a scale like we've never seen before. In some ways, you could argue that speech has never been so free, but then in breaking down those barriers of communication, it's also encouraged us to lock ourselves away in our echo chambers, surrounded by tribes of people who think just like us. And it's become a vicious cycle. So the more and more you use the media, the more its algorithms will feed you what you want to see from who you like to see, and you get hooked on this drip, this dopamine drip of hits of people agreeing with you all the time. And I think often about how we used to get to know each other in the past. It was through congregations, it was through churches, it was through community groups, it's the bastion of British culture, the village pub. And you would naturally collide with people with different viewpoints. You would have the rich, the poor, the old, the young, the conservative, the liberal, and you would have that natural collision of people together. Whereas now, if you're an enthusiastic flat earther with a foot fetish, you can go and find your tribe, and they will agree with you, and they will never challenge you, and they will constantly reaffirm your own virtue. What's not like? And it's like so much of the modern world, that convenience, you can think of sort of ultra-processed food, all these things, that convenience, that comfortability is outweighing some of these really important skills and values. And the more niche your tribe is, the more fervent it is. And the more fervent it is, the more it believes that anyone who dissents with you needs to be silenced. And they use this language of trauma and violence to back up this justification for what is quite severe oppression of opinions. But I don't think a tolerant society is one where everyone fits this narrow, preconceived idea of moral virtue, where only people with very certain points of views are allowed to speak their mind, but one which allows us to understand the people that we disagree with, and where a minority view has a place in the debate, something I know that you'll all feel quite keenly. And I think critically, our next generation of leaders, the students who many of you will be teaching at the moment, they're going to have to ride the technological wave of a lifetime. And we're going to set them up to fail if they think that they can go through life shouting people down if they think differently to them. And so that's why we legislated. What we were trying to do is defend and promote academic freedom. And so we created a Freedom of Speech Act. I can see Munira in the audience, who is one of the key people who did that in the UK as well. And it will hold universities accountable for the state of free speech on their campuses. It protects academic staff, students, and visiting speakers who want to advocate different points of views. We've created an Office of Students with a new Director of Freedom of Speech and Academic Freedom who will champion the need, he'll promote it. I think that was something which was very important to me because I didn't want it to come from a political place. I wanted someone who was politically removed, who's defended views on the left and the right so that they can talk about it and persuade people of all different positions. We have a brilliant guy called Dr. Arif Ahmed, some of you may know, who's going to take on that position we announced a few weeks ago. But we're also working across universities to ensure that they are teaching students in the beginning stages of their university careers about the importance of freedom of speech. We'll take action on providers who are breaching their duties to uphold freedom of speech. There will now be repercussions. You will have a complaint system which is free to use for academics, so there shouldn't be a financial barrier to them accessing it. And you will also be able to go to court if you need to seek redress. The other thing that we should do is help with visiting speakers. We've seen a small stream of people being cancelled in terms of going to speak, and you'll be able to apply for an injunction if you think your event should go ahead but is at threat of being shut down. So at every stage of the process, we have been thinking about academic freedom and keeping that at the forefront of our minds. Now, I'm not simple enough to believe that an act by itself will change things. I don't think culture is ever completely changed by legislation alone, but we are trying to create that step change. And we've already seen it work in part, actually. So we've seen an emboldened approach from some of our university leaders who are starting to fight back. And I think we've given them some cover and some framework to do that. And I'm delighted that Kathleen Stock, she was meant to be speaking at Oxford University a couple of weeks ago. And despite the attempts of some people to shut it down, she did in fact speak to curious and respectful students. And she was backed by strong action from the Vice-Chancellor, who put forward the viewpoint, which I completely agree with, that's very important for people to listen to her, but it's also really important that people could protest outside. And I'll end on this note, because I had the privilege of my own university years of being taught by the late, great Sir Roger Scruton, who was one of those philosophers that forced us to think. And he said, free speech is not the cause of the tensions growing around us, it's the only possible solution to them. And so as we head into our new century of technology, I hope that we can take this cherished Enlightenment value with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You surely have the what in place in the Freedom Act speech. Are you also confident that you have the how? We've learned this morning that statecraft is knowing what to do and also how to do it.
Well, I mean, it's a new thing. So we are now coming up with guidance, which will have to be implemented. But it is a very big change in terms of before, the view was that you could speak freely and someone would have to prove that you'd come up against a law, as we were discussing yesterday, to prove that you couldn't say it. And now I think it will have a slightly different mechanism. So that's what we'll be working on now. And, you know, as you point out, implementation is everything, but there is a lot to do.
Another theme this morning is artificial intelligence. Will AI help free speech to develop?
I'm not sure, to be honest, because I think one of the things that we've seen is the use of algorithms has actually narrowed people's viewpoints, despite it in theory making us more free. So I think we would have to guard against it quite seriously, because you can see a world where AI and large language models actually creates a narrowing of people's expression of opinion.